Welcome to Sleepless Folks. This is a place where we travel into the past slowly and quietly, allowing history to unfold as you drift toward sleep. Here, stories are told not to awaken the mind, but to gently guide it into rest. If you find comfort in calm voices, distant centuries, and forgotten worlds, you are in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. By the time this lecture reaches its end, your breathing will be deeper, your thoughts will softer, and sleep will have already found you. Now, close your eyes. Let the outside world fade away. The story is already beginning. Tonight, we will speak of the Black Death, the plague remembered as the most devastating epidemic in the history of Europe. It was not merely a disease, but a force that moved silently across borders, reshaped societies, and altered the fate of an entire continent. This is not only a story of numbers and dates, but of people, fear, belief, and transformation. The story begins in the year 1347. In that year, merchant ships entered the port of Messina, their sails heavy from long journeys across distant seas. At first, they appeared no different from any other trading vessels, but hidden within their holds and carried unknowingly by their crews was something far more dangerous than foreign goods. With those ships came a disease unlike anything Europe had ever known. Within months, it spread beyond the harbor. Within years, it would consume cities, empty villages, and claim tens of millions of lives. Streets fell silent, homes were abandoned, churches filled with prayers whispered in fear. Entire families vanished, leaving behind houses that would never again hear voices. The old order began to crumble, feudal systems weakened, labor became scarce, faith was tested, fear reshaped daily life, and death became a constant presence, no longer distant or abstract, but close enough to touch. The plague did not ask for permission, nor did it respect rank, wealth, or power. Kings and peasants, monks and merchants all faced the same unseen enemy. This catastrophe marked a turning point, a moment after which Europe would never be the same. From its shadows emerged new ideas, new anxieties, and eventually, new ways of understanding the world. The Middle Ages began to fracture, slowly giving way to a different future. Tonight, we will walk through that dark passage together. We will move slowly and without haste. We will explore how the plague spread, how people tried to explain it, and how societies responded when certainty disappeared. This is not a story meant to disturb you, but one meant to be understood and gently absorbed. So take a deep breath. Let your thoughts loosen their grip, and allow this quiet journey into history to carry you softly towards sleep. The roots of vulnerability. Why Europe was unprepared for the plague. At the beginning of the 14th century, Europe appeared to be a continent on the threshold of prosperity and growth. From the outside, everything suggested progress. The population had reached nearly 80 million people, the highest number since the fall of the Roman Empire. Cities were expanding, magnificent cathedrals and palaces rose above crowded streets, and craftsmanship and trade flourished. Merchant caravans crossed the continent without pause, linking distant regions into a single, growing economic network. Goods, ideas, and people moved more freely than ever before. To many observers of the time, European civilization seemed strong, confident, and secure. Nothing appeared to foreshadow disaster. Yet beneath this image of prosperity lay deep and dangerous weaknesses. The first and most critical problem was food scarcity. Population growth had far outpaced the expansion of cultivated land. Farms were divided again and again among heirs, becoming smaller and less productive. Peasant families lived close to the edge of survival, with little reserve for hard times. In such conditions, even a single failed harvest could trigger catastrophe. And catastrophe did come. In the year 1315, Europe was struck by one of the worst famines it had experienced in centuries. The crisis began with a sudden shift in climate associated with what historians now call the Little Ice Age. Relentless rains fell for months. Fields flooded. Crops rotted before they could mature. Cold, damp weather made grain unusable, and harvests collapsed across vast regions. The famine lasted from 1315 to 1317, but its consequences lingered long after. Bread prices rose nearly tenfold. Families exhausted their stored food and were forced to survive on wild plants, roots, and even tree bark. Chroniclers of the time recorded scenes of desperation, people eating dead animals found by the roadside, and in the most extreme cases, even resorting to cannibalism. The death toll was immense. Those who survived were often left permanently weakened. Children born during these years grew up frail and sickly. An entire generation entered adulthood with compromised health and weakened immune systems. Europe, already stretched thin, emerged from the famine exhausted and vulnerable. At the same time, the rapidly growing cities posed another serious threat to public health. Medieval cities were densely built, with narrow, winding streets and almost no systems for sanitation or drainage. Human waste, garbage, and dirty water were routinely dumped into the streets. People often threw the contents of chamber pots directly from their windows, shouting warnings to passers-by below. Filth collected in open ditches and stagnant puddles that were rarely cleaned. Homes were poorly ventilated, and overcrowding was common. Several families might share a single small room. Clothing was washed infrequently, and bathing was even rarer. Many people believed that frequent washing weakened the body and made it more susceptible to illness. According to prevailing medical ideas, hot water opened the pores of the skin, allowing harmful air, so-called bad vapors, to enter the body. As a result, most people limited hygiene to washing their hands and faces. Public bathhouses did exist in major cities such as Paris and London, but from the early centuries of the Middle Ages they gradually closed, as they were believed to spread disease and encourage moral corruption. These conditions created a perfect environment for parasites. Rats thrived in cities and granaries, feeding on stored grain. Fleas moved freely between animals and humans, unnoticed and uncontrolled. Today, we know that fleas living on rats carried the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the true cause of plague. But in the medieval world, this connection was entirely unknown. People sought explanations elsewhere. They believed epidemics were caused by miasma poison arising from rotting waste, swamps, or decaying bodies. Others saw disease as divine punishment for sin. No one suspected insects or microscopic organisms. Without understanding how illness spread, people had no way to stop it. Cities thus became places where even minor infections could spread rapidly, transforming into devastating epidemics. The situation was worsened by constant movement. Trade routes were active, pilgrims traveled between holy sites, and merchants crossed borders daily. Diseases could move vast distances in a matter of weeks. No one knew how to contain them, and there were no effective systems of quarantine. Finally, medieval medicine was tragically unprepared. Physicians followed ancient theories inherited from Hippocrates and Galen, which taught that health depended on the balance of four bodily humors. Disease was believed to result from imbalance, not infection. University medicine of the 14th century was also influenced by respected Arabic scholars such as Avicenna and Rhazes. Yet their teachings rested on the same classical foundations. Treatment consisted mainly of bloodletting, warming the body, and administering herbal mixtures. The concepts of bacteria, contagion, or immunity were entirely unknown. When the human body failed to fight an illness on its own, doctors were powerless. Thus, despite its apparent growth and prosperity, Europe on the eve of the Black Death was dangerously fragile. Overcrowded cities with appalling sanitation, a population weakened by recent famine, constant human mobility, and the complete helplessness of medieval medicine together created the ideal conditions for catastrophe. A disaster of unprecedented scale was not only possible, it was inevitable. and it was already on its way. The first warnings, news of the plague from Caffa. The earliest and most unsettling warnings of the coming catastrophe reached Europe from far beyond its eastern borders. From the distant edges of the Christian world where Europe met the vast lands of the East. In the year 1346, the Mongol army of Kanyani Bek was laying siege to the Genos fortress of Caffa, a fortified port city on the Crimean Peninsula. Caffa was more than a military outpost. It was one of the most important gateways of its time, a vital link between Europe and Asia, through which silk, spices, grain, and precious metals flowed steadily westward. The siege had already dragged on for months when something unexpected occurred. Within the Mongol camp, a strange and terrifying illness suddenly appeared. It spread with astonishing speed. Soldiers who had been strong and healthy only days before fell ill without warning. Hundreds began to die. The army weakened rapidly, not from battle, but from an unseen enemy that no weapon could reach. Facing a force they could neither fight nor understand, and unwilling to retreat in defeat, the Mongols were said to have taken a desperate and horrifying step. According to a contemporary account, they began using catapults to hurl the bodies of their dead soldiers over the walls of the city, hoping to spread the sickness among the defenders. This story was recorded by the Genos notary Gabriel de Musi. Modern historians continue to debate the accuracy of this account, and some question whether such an action truly took place. Yet the very existence of this story reveals something important. From the very first encounters with the disease, people were already overwhelmed by fear and horror. The illness appeared so unnatural, so unstoppable, that it seemed capable of turning even war itself into something grotesque and desperate. Whether or not the bodies were truly hurled into the city, one fact remains certain. From Caffa, the disease began to move. Merchant ships trading across the Black Sea soon carried more than cargo, and knowingly, they became vessels of death, transporting the infection from port to port. As sailors fell ill and died, the plague traveled with them, silently crossing seas and borders. Eyewitness accounts from this early stage describe symptoms that inspired absolute terror. Those who fell ill were struck suddenly. Their temperature rose sharply. Violent chills and burning fever seized the body at the same time. Within hours, a healthy person could be reduced to a state of near collapse. Painful swellings began to appear on the body, what later generations would call buboes. These dark, swollen lumps most often formed in the armpits, the neck, and the groin. They grew rapidly, sometimes reaching the size of an apple or a hen's egg. The pain was intense, almost unbearable, and the swellings often filled with pus. At the same time, victims could suffer from severe internal and external bleeding. Dark blotches appeared beneath the skin. Blood flowed from the nose and mouth. These blackened marks and hemorrhages gave the disease the name by which it would forever be remembered: the Black Death. The most terrifying form of all was the pneumonic plague. Those afflicted began to struggle for breath. They coughed violently, often coughing up blood. Strength faded quickly. Death could follow within 1 or 2 days. Worse still, this form of the disease spread directly from person to person. A single infected individual could pass the illness to an entire household, or even to neighbors. In a matter of hours, the disease moved faster than fear itself. Even the most experienced medieval physicians admitted they had never seen anything like it. Their knowledge offered no explanations, no cures, no protection. To many of them, the plague did not seem like a natural illness at all, but a message from hell itself, a sign of divine or demonic wrath unleashed upon humanity. And as these first reports spread westward, carried by rumor, trade, and trembling survivors, Europe stood unknowingly at the threshold of its darkest chapter. The plague reaches Europe. The plague reached Europe in the autumn of 1347. In October of that year, the first ships carrying death appeared off the shores of Sicily. Genoese vessels arriving from Caffa entered the harbor of Messina, bringing with them a catastrophe no one yet understood. Even before the ships reached the docks, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. Many members of the crew had died during the voyage. Those still alive were gravely ill, barely able to stand, their bodies marked by fever and pain. The authorities of Messina reacted with fear. Realizing the danger, they ordered the ships to leave the port at once and return to sea. But it was already too late. The disease had slipped ashore unnoticed, carried by sailors, goods, and invisible parasites. Within days, it began spreading through the streets of the city with astonishing speed. At first, the inhabitants of Messina failed to grasp the scale of the threat, but within a matter of days, death became impossible to ignore. Panic seized the population. Chroniclers wrote that those who appeared perfectly healthy in the morning were often dead or dying by nightfall. The number of victims grew so rapidly that traditional burial practices collapsed. Graveyards filled beyond capacity, and the authorities resorted to mass graves, where bodies were stacked by the dozens and hundreds, without ceremony or prayer. Corpses covered in dark blotches lay in the streets. The stench of death hung in the air. Terrified citizens abandoned their homes and fled the city, hoping to escape the curse. But this desperate flight only ensured that the infection spread further across Sicily. Within weeks, the plague appeared in other towns on the island. From there, it crossed to the Italian mainland. The vibrant network of Mediterranean trade became the plague's greatest ally. Merchant ships loaded with cloth, spices, and grain unknowingly became vehicles of death, carrying the infection along the coast. By the end of 1347, infected vessels had reached two of Europe's most important trading cities, Genoa and Venice. These cities were the beating heart of European commerce, and now they became the gateways through which the plague surged into the continent. From Genoa, the disease moved swiftly westward. By December 1347, it had reached the port city of Marseille. From there, following trade routes and river valleys, the plague spread deep into France. It traveled along the Rhine River and reached Paris by the middle of 1348. Spain soon followed. In the spring of 1348, cases were recorded in Barcelona and other major cities of Catalonia and Aragon. In less than 6 months, the infection had traveled from the shores of the Black Sea to the Atlantic coast, engulfing nearly all of southern Europe with terrifying speed. Some of the most horrifying scenes unfolded in the densely populated and economically powerful cities of Italy, such as Florence and Siena. These were places of constant movement and crowded streets, where commerce and daily life intertwined closely. Now, they became epicenters of despair. Contemporary chronicles, especially those from Siena, describe unimaginable devastation. People died faster than they could be buried. Entire families vanished within a single day. Bodies lay abandoned in the streets, their skin marked by dark stains, while the living were too afraid to approach them. Daily life came to a halt. Markets and shops closed. Church services were suspended. People feared opening doors and windows, convinced that deadly, poisoned air might drift inside. Silence replaced noise. Streets once full of voices and trade became nearly empty. Despair settled over cities like a heavy fog. Within just a few months of the plague's arrival in Messina, the disease had consumed Sicily, penetrated Italy's greatest commercial centers, and spread rapidly through southern France and Spain. The accounts preserved in medieval chronicles reveal that these were only the opening blows of the epidemic. Yet even at this early stage, Europe began to understand that it was facing a disaster unlike anything in its past, a catastrophe unprecedented in scale, relentless in its advance, and terrifying in its consequences. The true darkness was only beginning. attempts to stop the spread of the plague, and their desperate attempts to slow the spread of the disease. City authorities and ordinary citizens alike adopted a wide range of measures. Yet almost all of them were improvised, chaotic, and driven more by fear than understanding. Once it became clear that the illness could pass rapidly from one person to another, city governments began to act. Gates were closed. Entry was forbidden to merchants, travelers, and pilgrims. Some towns erected barricades along roads and bridges, posting guards to prevent anyone suspected of illness from entering. From a distance, these actions appeared decisive. In reality, they were usually taken far too late. By the time the gates were sealed, the plague had already slipped inside the city walls. Instead of protecting the population, isolation often trapped the healthy alongside the sick, accelerating the spread of infection. What had been intended as a shield became a prison. In larger cities, the reaction followed a grim pattern. As soon as rumors of mass death began to circulate, many wealthy and influential families fled. Nobles, officials, and merchants abandoned their homes and escaped to country estates, remote villas, or fortified castles, hoping distance and isolation would save them. Their departure emptied entire districts overnight. Those left behind were the poorest and most vulnerable, the streets filled with the sick, the elderly, and the desperate people with no means to flee and no one left to care for them. The collapse of social order followed quickly. With houses abandoned and authorities absent, looting became common. Mobs and opportunistic thieves roamed empty neighborhoods, stripping homes of anything valuable. Fear grew unchecked. Without leadership, without medicine, and without reliable information, many began to believe the world itself was coming to an end. Panic replaced reason. Suspicion turned neighbor against neighbor. Acts of mercy became rare, as people feared that even compassion could mean death. These early measures, though born of necessity, revealed a painful truth. Medieval society lacked the knowledge, coordination, and tools required to confront an invisible enemy. Each city acted alone, each decision made in haste, guided by rumor rather than science. And as these flawed efforts unfolded, the plague continued its advance, silent, relentless, and indifferent to human barriers. The struggle to contain it had begun, but humanity was still far from understanding the enemy it faced. Religious processions, as the authorities proved increasingly powerless in the face of the epidemic. Religious explanations and responses began to take center stage. For many people, the cause of the plague seemed obvious. They were convinced that the disease was a punishment sent by God for the sins of humanity, a divine warning meant to call the world to repentance. If the plague was God's wrath, then salvation, they believed, could be found only through prayer. Across cities in Italy, France, and Spain, massive religious processions were organized. Thousands of citizens gathered in the streets, moving slowly through narrow alleys and public squares. They recited prayers aloud, sang hymns, and carried sacred relics, icons, and crosses. Some walked barefoot, others wore penitential garments. All hoped that their collective suffering and devotion might soften divine judgment and bring mercy. These processions became scenes of intense emotion. People wept openly, confessed their sins, and begged for forgiveness. Bells rang without pause, the air filled with incense, chants, and the sound of footsteps echoing against stone walls. For many, these rituals provided the only sense of meaning and control left in a world collapsing around them. Yet the outcome was tragically different from what they hoped. Instead of stopping the disease, the processions often accelerated its spread. Packed tightly together for hours, people breathed the same air, touched the same relics, and moved shoulder to shoulder through the streets. In these dense crowds, the infection passed easily from one person to another, silently creating new chains of transmission. Gradually, Both city authorities and church leaders began to realize that mass gatherings were making the situation worse. In several cities, priests and bishops issued bans on public processions and large religious assemblies. They urged believers to pray privately, within their homes, rather than in crowds. But fear was stronger than obedience. Many people, overwhelmed by despair and the constant presence of death, ignored these prohibitions. Secret prayer meetings were held behind closed doors. Small groups continued to walk the streets at night, carrying relics and chanting softly. Convinced that abandoning public devotion would only hasten divine punishment, the contradiction was painful and tragic. Faith, which offered comfort and hope, also became an unwitting ally of the plague. Acts meant to bring salvation instead carried contagion. In their desperation to find meaning and mercy, people unknowingly deepened the disaster they were trying to escape. And so, beneath the flickering torchlight of prayerful crowds, the plague continued its work unseen, unstoppable, and indifferent to human belief. Medieval medicine, the attempts of medieval physicians to stop the epidemic appeared tragically helpless. As already mentioned, medicine of that era was built upon ancient theories inherited from classical antiquity. According to these beliefs, the human body was governed by four vital fluids, known as humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was thought to depend on their perfect balance, while disease was believed to rise whenever this balance was disturbed. Plague, like all illnesses, was interpreted through this framework to restore harmony within the body. Doctors were convinced that excess humors had to be removed. The most common treatment was bloodletting. In practice, this method weakened patients even further, draining them of strength at the very moment their bodies needed it most. Physicians sometimes performed bloodletting several times a day, reducing sufferers to complete exhaustion and often accelerating their death, because the disease was believed to be caused by poison or corrupted air emanating from rotting waste. Swamps, or decaying bodies. The primary form of prevention focused on cleansing the atmosphere. Fires were lit throughout cities, both inside homes and along the streets. Aromatic substances were burned constantly, filling the air with thick smoke and incense in the hope that it would purify the surroundings. In their panic, some citizens went even further. There are records of people setting fire to their own houses, believing that intense flames might destroy the disease itself. Others carried small pouches filled with herbs such as lavender, rosemary, and thyme, worn around the neck or kept in pockets. Pleasant scents, they believed, could repel deadly miasmas. Many placed their faith in magical amulets and talismans, thought to protect against curses and toxic vapors. Prayers were spoken everywhere. Church hymns echoed through streets and homes alike. Yet none of these measures could help, because the true cause of the disease, a bacterium, remained completely unknown. The doctors themselves attempted to protect their bodies as best they could. They wore long robes and cloaks made of waxed or oiled fabric, hoping that the dense material would prevent contaminated air from reaching their skin. Some physicians avoided touching patients altogether, attempting to diagnose illness from a distance. They relied on the color of the skin, the appearance of swellings, and even the smell of the sick person to judge the severity of the disease. Medical treatises of the time described the various stages of plague in great detail. Certain odors were believed to indicate how close a patient was to death. These texts gave the impression of knowledge and control, but in reality, they offered no effective protection. The true carriers of the disease, rats and fleas, went unnoticed. Doctors debated endlessly among themselves, arguing over which herbs or remedies were most effective. They wrote lengthy instructions and treatment manuals, filling pages with theories and prescriptions. All of this created an illusion of action and authority. In practice, people continued to die in enormous numbers, and no method brought real relief. As fear spread and confidence in medicine collapsed, Many of the sick were simply abandoned. Families were afraid to approach their own relatives. Neighbors avoided one another. Physicians and priests were far too few to care for everyone in need. Many plague victims died alone, locked inside their homes or lying helpless in the streets. In the end, bodies often remained where they had fallen for days. Only when men could be hired for payment, those brave or desperate enough to risk infection, were the dead finally removed. Medieval medicine, bound by ancient ideas and blind to the true nature of disease, stood powerless before the plague. And in that powerlessness, the full horror of the epidemic revealed itself, not only in death, but in isolation, fear, and the quiet collapse of human care. The plague in England. By the summer of 1348, the epidemic had already engulfed continental Europe and began its slow but inevitable movement toward the British Isles. England, which seemed protected by the waters of the English Channel, could not escape the approaching catastrophe. In the autumn of that same year, infected ships arrived in the English ports of Bristol, Southampton, and Weymouth. With them came the disease. From these coastal towns, the plague spread rapidly inland, reaching one settlement after another, following roads, rivers, and trade routes. The true peak of the epidemic came in 1349, a year remembered in English chronicles as the year of the Great Pestilence. By then, the disease raged across the entire kingdom. It spared neither large cities nor remote villages. London, one of the largest and most crowded cities in Europe at the time, became a place of unimaginable horror and chaos. Contemporary chronicles describe the capital as a vast open grave. Bodies of the dead, with no one left to bury them, were piled in the streets. City authorities struggled desperately to organize the removal of corpses and their burial beyond the city walls, but the number of victims far exceeded their capacity. Some chroniclers mention special carts that moved through the streets each day, collecting the dead. One eyewitness wrote that there were so many bodies that they fell from the carts onto the stone pavement and were left there, because the gravediggers no longer had the strength or time to lift them again. Panic gripped the population of London. Markets and shops closed. Artisans abandoned their workshops. Houses stood empty or locked from within. People avoided contact even with close relatives and neighbors, hoping that isolation might protect them from infection. Fear was so overwhelming that many of the sick were completely abandoned and died alone, without care or comfort. The authorities attempted to impose some order. Citizens were urged not to leave their homes without necessity and to avoid unnecessary contact. Yet these measures brought little relief, because no one understood how the disease truly spread. The royal court did not remain. King Edward III, along with his household, fled the capital and took refuge in the countryside, leaving London almost entirely without central governance. The situation worsened further because, as in the rest of Europe, England possessed neither effective sanitary services nor reliable methods of isolating the sick. Officials were uncertain how to respond and often limited themselves to calls for prayer and repentance. Church services and religious processions, initially organized in the hope of salvation, soon ceased. Priests themselves fell ill in great numbers and died alongside ordinary citizens. Chronicles of the time note that the plague showed no preference. It killed not only peasants, but also noble families, craftsmen, merchants, and members of the clergy. In some villages and small towns, nearly the entire population perished. Those who survived often abandoned these empty places, afraid to return. England's catastrophic weakness during the epidemic did not go unnoticed by its neighbors. In 1349, as the plague continued to ravage English towns and countryside alike, the Scots saw an opportunity. Believing England to be defenseless, they launched an invasion into northern territories, hoping for a swift and easy victory. Instead, disaster followed them. Soon after crossing the border, the same terrifying disease erupted within the Scottish camp. The outbreak was sudden and devastating. Soldiers began dying on the march. The army rapidly dwindled in number. The epidemic struck with such force that the campaign had to be abandoned entirely. The remaining troops retreated in panic back into Scotland, carrying the disease with them. Before long, Scottish lands were plunged into the same nightmare that had already consumed England. Historians estimate that during the Great Plague of 1349, England lost approximately half of its population. In London, the proportion may have been even higher. English chronicles describe cities and villages standing deserted, fields left unplowed, and roads overgrown with grass. As travel became both dangerous and meaningless, the country had been emptied of life, and as England sank into silence, Europe as a whole began to understand that the plague was not a passing disaster, but a force capable of reshaping entire nations, leaving behind a world forever changed. The Flagellants, as the disease continued to devastate European cities and villages. Despair and panic reached their breaking point. Unable to understand the true nature of the epidemic, society began to search for meaning and for blame within itself. Fear slowly transformed into anger, and confusion gave rise to extremism and collective madness. One of the most striking and tragic expressions of this despair was the rise of the Flagellant movement, which reached its peak in the year 1349. The Flagellants were wandering groups of men and women who believed that the plague was a punishment sent by God for the sins of humanity. If divine wrath had caused the catastrophe, then only extreme repentance, they believed, could bring salvation. Ordinary prayer was no longer enough. Suffering itself had to be offered as a sacrifice. Dressed in simple robes, the Flagellants traveled from city to city in large processions. As they moved through streets and public squares, they chanted prayers and sang psalms, while striking their own backs and shoulders with whips and cords. Blood flowed openly as they inflicted pain upon themselves before the eyes of stunned onlookers. Each blow was meant to atone not only for personal sins, but for the sins of all humanity. Their arrival provoked powerful emotions. Some people watched in awe, convinced that such visible devotion must surely move God to mercy. Others looked on in horror, disturbed by the spectacle of public self-torture. In certain places, even priests and monks joined the processions, believing that only such extreme acts of penance could halt the epidemic. For a time, the Flagellants seemed to offer something the authorities could not: certainty. They gave people a clear explanation for the plague and a visible path toward redemption. In a world stripped of control and meaning, their rituals provided structure and purpose, but the consequences were devastating. Instead of calming fear, the movement intensified it. Large gatherings of people traveling from town to town became ideal conditions for the spread of disease. Panic deepened, reason faded, and as the Flagellants gained followers, they began to challenge the authority of the established church, claiming that their form of repentance was more powerful than traditional prayers, sermons, or masses. This alarmed church leaders. Gradually, the Catholic Church turned against the movement. Clergy realized that the Flagellants were not only worsening the epidemic but also undermining religious order. Their practices bypassed official doctrine and placed spiritual authority in the hands of uncontrolled crowds. In response, Pope Clement VI publicly condemned the Flagellants as heretical. The movement was formally banned. Local authorities were ordered to arrest participants, disperse gatherings, and suppress further processions. Slowly, the movement began to fade, yet its legacy remained. The rise of the Flagellants revealed just how deeply shaken medieval society had become. Faced with an invisible and unstoppable enemy, people were willing to punish their own bodies, abandon reason, and embrace extreme beliefs in the hope of survival. The movement stands as a haunting reminder of how fear, when combined with faith and ignorance, can transform collective suffering into collective frenzy. And even as the whips fell and the chants echoed through medieval streets, the plague continued its silent advance unmoved by pain, prayer, or blood. Pogroms, and the search for scapegoats. An even more terrifying and destructive phenomenon soon followed: the mass pogroms against Jewish communities. As fear spread and death became omnipresent, many people searched for explanations not only in divine punishment, but in human conspiracy. Rumors began to circulate across Europe, carried from town to town by frightened voices. It was said that Jews were deliberately poisoning wells and water sources, seeking to destroy the Christian population from within. There was no evidence for these accusations. Yet in a world overwhelmed by terror, reason held little power. In thousands of villages and cities, these rumors were accepted as truth. Panic turned into hatred, and hatred into violence. Across Europe, waves of brutality erupted. Jews were seized in the streets, dragged from their homes, tortured in public, and forced to confess crimes they had never committed. Entire families were executed. Entire communities were destroyed. Many victims were burned alive, sometimes in their homes, sometimes in public squares, sometimes in vast communal fires meant to serve as both punishment and warning. The scale of the violence was unprecedented. The most horrific pogroms occurred during the years 1348 and 1349. One of the darkest episodes took place in the city of Strasbourg on February 14, 1349. There, several thousand Jews were arrested, brutally tortured, and then publicly burned alive on a massive pyre constructed in the city square. Similar atrocities unfolded across the cities of the Holy Roman Empire, as well as in France and Spain. In some regions, Jews were offered a grim choice: forced baptism or death. A few survived through conversion. Many more were slaughtered regardless, denied any chance to defend themselves or prove their innocence. The violence grew so extreme that even the highest authority of the Church could no longer remain silent. Pope Clement VI intervened personally. He issued a papal bull condemning the accusations against Jews as false and baseless. He reminded Christian rulers that Jews, too, were dying of the plague, and that they could not be responsible for its spread. He called upon local authorities to protect Jewish communities and to put an end to the killings. But his voice was not always heard. In many places, fear outweighed faith. Hatred drowned out reason. Pogroms and executions continued for months, claiming tens of thousands of lives, particularly in the German lands and parts of France. In some cities, Jewish communities were almost entirely annihilated, leaving behind empty streets and silent synagogues. Those who managed to escape fled eastward. Large numbers of Jews sought refuge in Poland and Lithuania, where rulers offered comparatively safer conditions and legal protections. These migrations would reshape the demographic and cultural map of Eastern Europe for centuries to come. The pogroms of the Black Death stand as one of the darkest chapters in European history, a tragic reminder of how fear can turn neighbors into enemies and suffering into cruelty. As the plague ravaged bodies, panic ravaged conscience, and in the shadow of mass graves and burning cities, Europe revealed not only its vulnerability to disease, but its vulnerability to fear itself. Witch hunts, fear, and the northern spread of the plague. Within the atmosphere of fear and confusion created by the plague, suspicions of witchcraft also began to surface. For some people, the mysterious nature of the disease seemed to point not only to divine punishment, but to the work of dark and malicious forces. Unable to explain the epidemic in rational terms, they searched for human agents behind it. From time to time, Individuals were accused of practicing witchcraft or of entering secret pacts with the devil in order to spread the disease. Those suspected were occasionally arrested, interrogated, and executed, often by burning. It is important to note, however, that during the time of the Black Death these cases were still relatively limited in number. The large-scale witch hunts for which Europe later became infamous would emerge primarily in the 15th and 16th centuries, long after the plague had passed. Yet even these early accusations reveal how deeply shaken society had become. Faced with an invisible and incomprehensible threat, people turned against one another, driven by fear and desperation. The inability to understand the true nature of the epidemic, combined with the absence of any reliable explanation or effective treatment, gave rise to bursts of cruelty and suspicion. Violence born of fear became one of the tragic features of the Age of the Black Death, while the plague swept rapidly through southern and western Europe, claiming thousands of lives each day. Its advance into Central Europe and Scandinavia was slower. These regions were reached later, in part because of their geographical position and their more limited involvement in the dense international trade networks that had carried the disease so swiftly across the Mediterranean and Western Europe. In Norway, the plague arrived only in 1349. Scandinavian chronicles describe the arrival of a single English ship in the port of Bergen. By the time it reached the harbor, almost the entire crew had died during the voyage. This grim episode marked the beginning of the epidemic in Norway. From Bergen, the disease spread rapidly through the city, and then outward across the country. From Norway, the plague moved eastward into Sweden, which it reached around 1350. There, it traveled along internal trade routes and merchant caravans, carrying the infection deep into northern territories. Despite its delayed arrival, the consequences for Scandinavia were just as catastrophic as elsewhere in Europe. Entire villages disappeared, and in some regions the population was reduced by more than half. Poland and Bohemia, however, were long believed to be exceptions, according to later traditions and popular legends. These lands were said to have suffered far less from the plague than the rest of Europe. One widespread explanation claimed that Polish authorities had wisely and decisively closed the country's borders, preventing merchants and foreigners from entering. Other versions spoke of special sanitary measures, exceptional piety among the population, or even the protection of a particular saint. Modern historians, however, view these accounts with skepticism. They point out that such strict border controls would have been nearly impossible to enforce under medieval conditions. There is no convincing evidence that Poland or Bohemia escaped major losses. It is far more likely that reports of lower mortality stem from the poor survival of written sources, or from the scarcity of contemporary records in those regions. Current research suggests a different conclusion. The plague did not spare any part of Europe. While its intensity varied from place to place, no region was truly untouched. The Black Death reached every corner of the continent, leaving behind a trail of loss, fear, and transformation that reshaped Europe forever. In the end, the plague revealed not only the fragility of the human body, but also the fragility of human understanding. Where knowledge was absent, fear filled the void, and where fear ruled, reason often fell silent. Eastern Europe and the lands of Rus. Far less is known about the spread of the plague across Eastern Europe and the lands of medieval Rus. The sources that have survived to our time speak of outbreaks of deadly illness, but they do so briefly and fragmentarily, often without detail. Because of this, historians approach these records with great caution. Medieval chronicles rarely distinguished clearly between different diseases. Terms such as more, meaning pestilence or great death, were used broadly to describe any devastating epidemic. Typhus, cholera, dysentery, and plague were often grouped together under the same name. As a result, It is difficult to determine with certainty which outbreaks described in the sources were truly cases of bubonic plague. Even so, most scholars agree that the plague did reach the lands of Rus in the middle of the 14th century. The most likely routes of transmission lay in the northwest, through the major trading centers of Novgorod and Pskov. These cities were deeply connected to the commercial networks of the Hanseatic League, which linked northern and eastern Europe with ports of the Baltic Sea and beyond. Merchants, goods, and ships moved constantly along these routes, and with them traveled disease. Chronicles from Novgorod mention sudden waves of death, empty streets, and the collapse of ordinary life. Churches filled with prayers, while bells rang for the dead with such frequency that the sound became almost continuous. In some accounts, entire households vanished, leaving behind silent homes and abandoned fields. In Pskov, similar descriptions appear. The disease struck swiftly, overwhelming communities that had little means to respond. As elsewhere in Europe, fear spread faster than understanding. People turned to prayer, fasting, and religious rites, hoping to find protection in faith when no earthly remedy existed. Yet compared to Western Europe, the overall picture in Eastern Europe remains blurred. The scarcity of written sources, the destruction of records over time, and the political fragmentation of the region all make it difficult to reconstruct events with precision. It is also possible that population density, settlement patterns, and regional differences in trade reduced the intensity of the first wave in some areas, though not enough to spare them entirely. What seems clear is this: the plague did not stop at cultural, religious, or political borders. It followed rivers, roads, and trade routes, reaching even the distant edges of the known world. The lands of Rus, like the rest of Europe, became part of a shared catastrophe, one that transcended kingdoms and belief systems, leaving behind silence, loss, and a profound sense of vulnerability. In this way, the Black Death revealed the hidden truth of the medieval world. Despite distances and differences, Europe was already deeply interconnected. And when the plague came, it reminded humanity that no land was truly isolated. The fading of the first wave. By the beginning of 1351, the first great wave of the Black Death slowly began to subside in most parts of Europe. The terror that had swept across the continent did not disappear overnight, but its intensity gradually lessened. This decline did not come through victory or understanding, but through a combination of grim and accidental factors. First, the epidemic had already taken an enormous toll. In many regions, such a large portion of the population had died that there were simply too few people left for the disease to spread rapidly. Entire neighborhoods stood empty. Villages were reduced to a handful of survivors. The plague, having consumed so many lives, began to run out of hosts. Second, those who survived infection appeared to gain a certain degree of resistance. While medieval people could not understand this in scientific terms, the effect was real. As the number of immune survivors increased, chains of transmission weakened, and the pace of the epidemic slowed. At the same time, communities began, often through painful experience, to change their behavior. Isolation of the sick became more common. Families fled infected towns and villages at the first signs of disease. Roads emptied, markets fell silent, and social contact decreased. These instinctive forms of distancing, though unplanned and uneven, helped reduce the intensity of transmission. Another important factor was the very nature of the plague itself. The disease did not spread evenly or continuously. It moved in waves. In one region, it would flare violently, claiming lives at a terrifying speed, and then gradually burn itself out. For new outbreaks to occur, the pathogen had to be reintroduced from outside, usually through trade routes, ships, or migrating populations. Over time, such new introductions became less frequent. By the early 1350s, the relentless momentum of the first wave had slowed. Church bells rang less often. Streets grew quieter, not only from death, but from exhaustion. Survivors emerged cautiously from hiding, unsure whether the nightmare had truly ended or was merely sleeping. Yet even as the first wave faded, no one believed the danger was gone forever. The plague had not been defeated, it had merely withdrawn, and Europe, forever changed by what it had endured, stood uncertainly in the silence that followed, knowing now that the Black Death could return at any time, and that the world it had known before would never fully return. The consequences of the Black Death. Demographic transformation. Although the plague never truly disappeared and continued to return in smaller outbreaks in the years that followed, the catastrophe of 1348 was never repeated on the same scale. Yet the consequences of that first wave were immense. Historians estimate that the Black Death claimed between 25 and 50 million lives in Europe alone, as much as half of the continent's population. No previous disaster in European history had come close to such destruction. Never before had death swept so deeply, so quickly, and so indiscriminately through every layer of society. After the first wave of the plague, Europe was no longer the same. The transformation was not only demographic, but psychological, social, and economic. When the epidemic finally began to subside, the continent appeared exhausted and hollowed out. In the middle of the 14th century, people were confronted with a haunting new landscape. Where lively villages and cultivated fields had once stood, there was now silence. Thousands of settlements vanished entirely from the map. These abandoned places became known as dead lands, territories left empty, slowly overtaken by weeds, shrubs, and forests. Roads disappeared beneath grass. Fields returned to wilderness. In many regions, particularly in England, Germany, and France, entire districts were so severely depopulated that even decades after the plague they remained unsettled. Houses collapsed from neglect. Churches stood roofless and silent. The land itself seemed to mourn its lost inhabitants. This demographic collapse reshaped everyday life. There were fewer mouths to feed, but also far fewer hands to work the land. Agriculture declined sharply in some areas, while in others it slowly adapted to new conditions. The rhythm of medieval life, once defined by dense communities and constant labor, was broken. Yet alongside the tragedy, there emerged consequences no one had anticipated. For those who survived, the world had changed irrevocably and in some cases, unexpectedly, in their favor. The immense loss of life altered the balance between people and land, between labor and power. Scarcity of workers would soon challenge old social structures and weaken long-standing hierarchies. The Black Death did not merely kill millions. It reshaped the human landscape of Europe. And from the ruins of abandoned villages and silent fields, a new chapter of European history was beginning to form, slowly, painfully, and forever marked by memory. The consequences of the Black Death. Improved conditions for labor as a direct result of the enormous loss of life. Europe faced an unprecedented shortage of labor. So many people had died that fields lay untilled, workshops stood silent, and entire estates struggled to function. Peasants had become scarce, and for the first time in centuries, this scarcity shifted the balance of power. Landowners and feudal lords were forced to compete for workers to keep their lands productive and their incomes intact. They had little choice but to raise wages and offer better conditions. Across much of Europe, payments for agricultural labor and skilled work increased sharply. For ordinary peasants and artisans, this marked a profound change. For the first time in many generations, common people experienced a genuine improvement in their material lives. Survivors discovered that they were no longer easily replaceable. They could choose where to work, negotiate for higher pay, and demand better treatment. Mobility increased. A peasant could leave one estate for another that offered more favorable terms. A craftsman could set his price higher, knowing his skills were urgently needed. Daily life began to change. They had improved for some. Living conditions slowly became better. Opportunities that had once been unthinkable opened before those who had survived the plague. What had begun as a catastrophe now carried the seeds of transformation for the ruling elite. However, this shift was deeply unsettling. The feudal system depended on a stable supply of cheap, dependent labor of peasants bound to the land and obligated to serve their lord. That foundation had now cracked. The sudden empowerment of the lower classes threatened the established social order. In England, the response was swift and defensive. In 1351, the authorities introduced what became known as the Statute of Laborers. This law attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and made it illegal to pay workers more than they had earned before the epidemic. It also restricted the movement of peasants, forbidding them to leave their villages in search of better opportunities without permission. On paper, the law appeared firm and authoritative. In reality, it proved almost impossible to enforce. The population had shrunk too drastically. Labor was simply too valuable. Landowners themselves often ignored or quietly violated the statute, offering higher wages or better terms to avoid losing their remaining workers. Survival mattered more than legality. Thus, despite official resistance, change continued. The Black Death had not only killed millions, it had weakened the rigid structures that had governed medieval life for centuries. Though feudalism would not collapse overnight, its foundations were irreversibly shaken. From the suffering of the epidemic emerged a slow but powerful shift toward greater personal freedom, economic mobility, and social change. And in this way, the plague reshaped Europe not only through death, but through the unexpected rise of those who survived. The consequences of the Black Death, taxation, and the 100 Years' War in France. The consequences of the Black Death unfolded along a different and far more turbulent path. Rather than introducing direct laws to suppress rising wages, French authorities chose another approach. The burden of recovery was placed squarely on the shoulders of peasants and ordinary townspeople through sharply increased taxes. What little improvement in living conditions survivors might have hoped for was quickly undermined by heavy fiscal pressure. This strain was intensified by the ongoing 100 Years' War. By the mid-14th century, the conflict between England and France had already dragged on for decades. Large parts of the French countryside were devastated by warfare. Armies moved constantly across the land, requisitioning food, destroying crops, and pillaging villages. Even more destructive were the roaming bands of mercenaries, former soldiers, after campaigns ended, turned to banditry and lived by plunder. For peasants, life became a cycle of fear and loss. Farms were looted before they could recover from the plague. Livestock was stolen. Homes were burned. Many families lived under the constant threat of violence, unable to rebuild even the most basic foundations of their livelihood. Taxes rose, protection vanished, and survival itself became uncertain. Together, these pressures created an explosive situation. By the summer of 1358, social tension in northern France reached a breaking point. A massive peasant uprising erupted in an event remembered as the Jacquerie. The name came from the contemptuous nickname Jacques Bonhomme, used by nobles to mock common peasants as simple-minded and inferior. Thousands of peasants took up arms. They poured onto the roads and into the countryside of northern France. attacking castles, manor houses, and estates of the nobility. Property was destroyed. Noble families were killed. Chroniclers of the time described the uprising as shocking in its ferocity and rage. The revolt was fueled not by ideology, but by accumulated suffering, years of humiliation, crushing taxes, lawlessness, and abuse at the hands of soldiers and lords erupted into violent revenge. Castles were set on fire. Monasteries were looted. Symbols of aristocratic power were deliberately targeted and destroyed. Yet, the uprising was brief. The jackery lasted only a few weeks in the summer of 1358. The response of the nobility was swift and merciless. A coalition of knights and professional soldiers was quickly assembled. They moved systematically through the rebellious regions, crushing resistance without mercy. The repression was brutal. Estimates suggest that between 20 and 30,000 peasants were killed during the suppression of the revolt. Leaders of the uprising were publicly executed as a warning to others. Villages suspected of supporting the rebels were burned to the ground. Entire communities vanished in acts of collective punishment. Although the rebellion was defeated, its meaning endured. The jackery revealed how profoundly Europe had changed after the plague. Ordinary people were no longer willing to accept their old place without question. The epidemic had stripped away fear of death and with it, fear of authority. For the first time, the feudal elite sensed that its power was no longer absolute. The consequences of the Black Death reached far beyond population loss. They reshaped social relations, exposed the fragility of political order, and planted the seeds of future upheaval. And as Europe struggled to rebuild amid war, rebellion, and uncertainty, the effects of the plague began to appear not only in economics and society, but also in culture, art, and spiritual life. The world had survived, but it had been irrevocably transformed. The impact of the epidemic on culture and art. The catastrophe of the Black Death forced people to reconsider values that had once seemed stable and unquestionable. Life, which had always been fragile, now revealed itself as suddenly and brutally temporary. Death no longer appeared as a distant certainty of old age or war, but as an unpredictable presence that could strike anyone at any moment. This awareness deeply reshaped European culture. The inevitability and suddenness of death found powerful expression in literature, painting, and philosophy. Artists and writers turned their attention to themes of mortality, fate, and the fleeting nature of earthly existence. At the same time, many sought not only to depict despair, but to find ways of resisting it emotionally, spiritually, and imaginatively. One of the most vivid cultural monuments born from the experience of the plague was the Decameron, written shortly after the epidemic, in 1353, by the Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio. The work is framed as a collection of stories told by 10 young people who flee plague-stricken Florence and take refuge in a secluded countryside villa. There, far from the sound of funeral bells and the fear that grips the city, they pass the time by telling one another stories, tales of love and betrayal, wit and folly, tragedy and laughter. This setting itself speaks volumes. The Decameron reflects a profound shift in worldview. On one level, it acknowledges the overwhelming presence of death and the fragility of human life. On another, it represents a deliberate act of resistance, an attempt to shield the human spirit, even temporarily, from horror through storytelling, humor, affection, and pleasure, rather than turning entirely toward despair or strict moral judgment. Boccaccio's work affirms life. It suggests that even in the shadow of catastrophe, people seek connection, meaning, and joy. Laughter becomes a form of survival. Love becomes a defiance of fear. Storytelling becomes a way to preserve humanity when the world itself seems to be collapsing. For centuries, the Decameron has stood as a symbol of Europe's cultural response to the Black Death. It captures not only grief and loss, but resilience. It shows that amid suffering, the human desire to live fully, to feel, to speak, to imagine, does not disappear. The plague changed Europe profoundly. It altered demographics, economies, and social structures. But it also reshaped the inner life of the continent. Art and literature began to reflect a more intimate awareness of death, and alongside it, a deeper appreciation for life itself. In this way, culture became both a mirror of trauma and a quiet form of healing. And even as Europe emerged from one of the darkest chapters in its history, it carried forward a new understanding that humanity, though fragile, is capable of preserving meaning, beauty, and compassion even in the face of overwhelming loss. The dance of death and the triumph of death. The theme of death became central not only in literature, but also in visual art. In the years following the plague, artists across Europe began to give form to what people had witnessed with their own eyes, and death as a constant, unavoidable companion of everyday life. One of the most powerful and enduring motifs to emerge from this period was the dance of death. In these images, death is personified as a skeleton, sometimes grinning, sometimes solemn, inviting people to join an endless procession. One by one, figures from every level of society are drawn into the dance: popes and kings, bishops and nobles, merchants, peasants, women, and even children. All hold hands with death. All move together toward the same final destination. The message of the dance of death was unmistakable. Before death, all are equal. Wealth, power, knowledge, and social rank offer no protection. No one can refuse the invitation. No one can step aside. The plague had revealed this truth with terrifying clarity, and art transformed it into a visual lesson meant to be understood by all. These images appeared first in Germany and France, often painted on church walls, cemeteries, and cloisters, places where the living and the dead already met in silence. From there, the motif spread rapidly across Europe, becoming one of the most recognizable symbols of the late Middle Ages and remaining influential for centuries. Equally powerful was another artistic theme born from the experience of Epidemic: the triumph of death. This motif found its most striking expression in monumental frescoes, particularly in Italy. In these works, death is no longer a guide inviting humanity to dance, but an overwhelming force sweeping across the world. Armed skeletons ride through landscapes of ruin. Cities burn. Villages collapse. Bodies lie scattered across the ground. Death dominates everything. Kings fall beside beggars. Youth lies beside age. Beauty, strength, and hope are crushed without distinction. There is no mercy, no negotiation, no escape. Humanity appears helpless, reduced to fragile figures, overwhelmed by a power far greater than itself. These images reflected a deep psychological transformation. The plague had shattered the medieval belief in a stable and orderly world governed by predictable rules. Instead, people were confronted with chaos, randomness, and sudden annihilation. Art no longer merely illustrated religious teachings, it bore witness to trauma. The dance of death and the triumph of death were not meant only to frighten. They were reminders, warnings, reflections of a collective realization that life was fleeting, and that certainty could vanish in an instant. At the same time, these works invited contemplation. If death was inevitable, then how should one live? If all were equal in the end, what meaning did power truly hold? In this way, the art of the plague years did more than depict destruction. It forced Europe to confront mortality openly and honestly, and in doing so, laid the emotional and philosophical groundwork for a new understanding of human existence. Death became visible, but so did the urgency of life. Religious transformation and apocalyptic moods. The changes brought by the Black Death were no less profound in the religious and spiritual life of European society. The catastrophe dealt a devastating blow to the authority of the Catholic Church. Faced with the epidemic, the Church proved unable to protect the faithful from disease, nor could it offer a clear or convincing explanation for the suffering that engulfed the continent. Prayer, processions, and rituals failed to stop the spread of death. For many believers, this failure shattered long-held assumptions about divine protection and spiritual order. The crisis was intensified by the behavior of the clergy themselves. Large numbers of priests and monks fell victim to the plague. Others, overwhelmed by fear, fled from infected cities and villages, abandoning their parishes and monasteries. To ordinary believers, this felt like a betrayal at the very moment when spiritual guidance was needed most. Churches stood empty. Sacraments went unadministered. The faithful felt left alone in the face of death. As trust in the Church weakened, alternative forms of belief began to spread. Mystical movements, sects, and self-proclaimed prophets gained followers by claiming special knowledge of the plague's origins and of the path to salvation. Some preached that the epidemic was a sign of imminent apocalypse. Others promised protection through secret prayers, rituals, or moral purification. These groups flourished in an atmosphere of fear, uncertainty, and spiritual hunger. Apocalyptic thinking became widespread. People returned obsessively to ancient prophecies, especially the visions of the apocalypse described in the Book of Revelation. The imagery of devastating diseases, mass death, and divine judgment seemed to mirror the world they were witnessing around them. In the medieval imagination, the Black Death appeared not as a random disaster, but as one of the final signs foretold before the end of time. Many sincerely believed they were living in the last days before the Last Judgment, across all levels of society. Apocalyptic expectations took hold. Merchants, peasants, nobles, and scholars alike feared that history itself was drawing to a close. Repentance and prayer were seen as the only remaining refuge. The future was no longer imagined as something to be built, but as something to be endured until divine judgment arrived. At the same time, the Catholic Church faced a deep internal crisis. The papal court and monastic institutions, once surrounded by reverence and authority, now encountered growing disappointment and anger. Clergy were accused of greed, corruption, cowardice, and neglect of their spiritual duties. Many believers felt that the Church had failed not only practically, but morally. This erosion of trust had lasting consequences. The authority of traditional church structures weakened. Space opened for dissent, alternative interpretations of faith, and religious experimentation. New heresies appeared. Old divisions deepened. The foundations were laid for future religious conflicts that would reshape Europe in the centuries to come. The Black Death did not destroy faith, but it transformed it. Belief became more personal, more fearful, and often more extreme. Certainty gave way to doubt. Rituals lost their comforting predictability, and beneath prayers for salvation lay a haunting question that could no longer be ignored. If suffering could strike so suddenly and so universally, what did it truly mean to be protected by God? In the silence left behind by the plague, Europe's spiritual landscape was forever altered, marked by anxiety, introspection, and a profound sense that the old world, both earthly and divine, had begun to fracture. The search for new ways to confront epidemics in the long term. The catastrophe of the plague pushed European society toward the search for new, more rational and practical ways of confronting epidemics. Slowly and painfully, people began to realize that the old methods of prayer alone, mystical explanations, and ritual responses were not enough. Faith still mattered, but it could no longer serve as the only defense against disease. Out of suffering emerged the first hesitant steps toward public health. In many cities, especially in the Mediterranean world, authorities began experimenting with early sanitary measures. Efforts were made to clean streets of waste more regularly, to remove refuse and animal carcasses, and to limit the most dangerous sources of contamination. Primitive rules were introduced to regulate markets and trade, particularly in port cities where ships from distant regions arrived daily. These measures were inconsistent and often poorly enforced. Yet they marked something entirely new, the idea that disease could be managed, not only endured. For the first time, urban governments began to treat health as a collective responsibility rather than a purely spiritual matter. These early institutions were fragile and imperfect, but they laid the foundations for future developments in hygiene, sanitation, and public health, changes that would transform European life centuries later. Despite the end of the most devastating wave, Europe did not escape the plague. Although the first and deadliest phase of the Black Death came to an end around 1353, the disease never fully disappeared. It returned again and again, haunting cities and villages throughout the following century. People gradually came to understand that the plague was no longer a single catastrophe, but a recurring presence, a shadow that might reappear at any time. Just a few years after the Great Pandemic, a new outbreak struck. In 1361, Europe experienced another severe epidemic, remembered in history as the Children's Plague. The name reflected a cruel reality. This wave struck especially hard among children and young people born after the first pandemic. Having no prior exposure, they possessed no natural resistance to the disease. The epidemic swept through England, France, and parts of continental Europe, claiming countless young lives. For survivors of the earlier catastrophe, it reopened old wounds. Bells rang again. Graves filled again. The illusion that the nightmare had ended was shattered. The Children's Plague served as a grim reminder. The Black Death was not a single moment in history, but a long era of fear and adaptation. It forced Europe to live with uncertainty and, slowly, to learn from it. Each return of the disease reinforced the need for better understanding, better organization, and better methods of protection. In this way, even as the plague continued to take lives, it also drove Europe forward, toward knowledge, toward responsibility, and toward the earliest beginnings of modern medicine. The scars remained, but so did the lesson. The enduring return of the plague after the Great Pandemic. Although the so-called Children's Plague was far less devastating in scale than the catastrophe of 1348, its psychological impact on society was profound. It forced people to confront a painful realization: the danger had not passed. The plague was no longer a single disaster of the past, but a persistent threat, one that would remain part of life for years, and even generations to come. Throughout the late 14th century and across the entire 15th century, Europe experienced repeated outbreaks of plague. The disease returned again and again, striking cities, towns, and villages with grim regularity. Thousands of lives were lost in each wave, even if no single outbreak matched the scale of the first Great Pandemic. Over time, something subtle but significant began to change. Fear did not disappear, but it transformed. The initial panic and shock gave way to a darker, quieter emotion: resignation. A sense of fatalism settled over society. People began to accept death as a constant presence, something woven into the fabric of everyday life. The plague became familiar. Its return was no longer entirely unexpected. Bells ringing for the dead, sudden quarantines, abandoned homes, these became tragic but recognizable patterns. What had once been unimaginable horror slowly turned into a grim routine. People learned to live with uncertainty. They continued to work, trade, marry, and raise children, all while knowing that disease might return at any moment. Life was no longer planned with confidence in the future, but with an awareness of its fragility. This constant exposure to loss forged a kind of psychological endurance, not hope, but survival. Communities adapted emotionally as much as practically. The repeated waves of plague reshaped how people understood fate, time, and existence itself. Death ceased to be an interruption of life and became one of its defining conditions. In this world, endurance mattered more than expectation, and resilience replaced optimism. The Black Death, in its lingering presence, taught Europe how to live in the shadow of uncertainty. And in doing so, it quietly transformed the medieval mindset, preparing the ground for a new relationship with risk, responsibility, and the fragile value of human life. The first quarantine measures in Europe in response to the recurring waves of plague. European societies slowly began to develop more systematic and organized approaches to controlling disease. Fear alone was no longer enough. Experience had taught harsh lessons, and from those lessons emerged the earliest foundations of public health policy. One of the most important innovations of this period was the practice of quarantine. The first officially recorded quarantine measures in European history were introduced in the medieval port city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, in the year 1377. Ragusa was a vital trading hub on the Adriatic Sea, constantly exposed to ships arriving from plague-affected regions. Recognizing the danger, the city authorities issued a law requiring all arriving ships, crews, and merchants to remain isolated at anchor for a period of 30 days before being allowed to enter the city. This isolation was meant to ensure that any signs of illness would appear before contact with the local population. Soon after, the isolation period was extended to 40 days. This duration gave rise to the very word quarantine, derived from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. The number itself carried both practical and symbolic meaning: long enough to observe illness, and also resonant with biblical traditions of purification and trial. This was a historic turning point. For the first time in Europe, disease was treated not only as a spiritual problem, but as a phenomenon that could be managed through regulation, observation, and enforced isolation. Though the true cause of plague was still unknown, the logic behind quarantine proved remarkably effective. The practice spread. In the 15th century, quarantine systems were further refined in the Italian city-states, especially in Venice, one of the most powerful maritime republics of the era. In 1423, Venice officially mandated a 40-day quarantine for all arriving ships and traders. Vessels were required to remain on specially designated islands outside the city, later known as lazarettos. These isolated locations kept potentially infected people and goods far from the densely populated urban center, reducing the risk of outbreak. The Venetian system proved highly effective. So effective, in fact, that it soon became a model for other trading cities across Europe. Port after port adopted similar rules, recognizing that prevention was far less costly than unchecked catastrophe. As the 15th century progressed, anti-epidemic measures became more sophisticated. Beyond quarantine in ports, authorities began establishing sanitary cordons on land. When reports of plague emerged in a particular region, roads were blocked, travel was restricted, and armed guards were stationed at borders and crossroads. Entire areas could be sealed off in an attempt to contain the disease. These measures were not always successful. Plague could still break through, carried by desperation, smuggling, or sheer chance. Yet sanitary cordons often slowed the spread significantly, buying precious time. Time to prepare, time to isolate, time to survive. What mattered most was the shift in thinking. Disease was no longer seen solely as fate or punishment. It became something that demanded planning, coordination, and collective responsibility. These early efforts were imperfect, sometimes harsh, and often uneven, but they marked the beginning of a new relationship between society and illness. From the ashes of catastrophe emerged the first principles of epidemic control. And in this quiet transformation, shaped by loss and repetition, Europe began slowly to learn how to defend itself against invisible enemies. The plague in Milan, 1630. By the beginning of the 17th century, Europe had grown accustomed to the recurring return of plague. The disease had become a grim, familiar presence feared, but no longer entirely unexpected. And yet, several devastating outbreaks in this later period revealed a painful truth. Despite centuries of experience, European cities still remained largely defenseless in the face of epidemic catastrophe. One of the most terrifying and well-documented of these later outbreaks was the plague that struck Milan in the year 1630. The scale of the epidemic was immense. Death spread rapidly through the densely populated city, overwhelming existing systems of control. Faced with panic and mounting casualties, Milanese authorities resorted to some of the harshest measures ever recorded in European epidemic history. They chose absolute isolation. Officials ordered that houses containing infected individuals be sealed completely. Doors and windows were bricked up with stone and mortar. In some cases, wooden planks were nailed across entrances to ensure that no one could enter and no one could leave. Entire families were imprisoned inside their own homes. Marks and warning inscriptions were painted onto the walls of these sealed buildings, alerting passersby to stay away from the infected dwelling. Streets grew quiet. Neighbors crossed to the opposite side of the road. Fear dictated every movement. The consequences were horrifying. Those trapped inside sealed houses were condemned not only to illness, but often to starvation and dehydration. Even if someone managed to survive the plague itself, they could still die slowly from lack of food and water. Some residents tried desperately to escape, tearing at walls or forcing doors apart with bare hands. Others begged through cracks and broken windows, pleading with strangers for bread or water. Most pleas went unanswered. The terror of contagion was stronger than compassion. People were afraid to come close. To help was to risk death. Chroniclers of the time described Milan as a city consumed not only by disease, but by cruelty born of fear. Despair hardened hearts. Trust dissolved. Survival instincts overpowered humanity. The epidemic left scars for a deeper than physical loss. It etched itself into the collective memory of Italy as a warning of how far society could go when panic replaced reason. The plague of 1630 demonstrated a grim paradox. Even as Europe developed more systematic methods of epidemic control, extreme measures could still lead to profound moral collapse. Isolation saved lives, but when taken to its absolute limit, it also destroyed them. Milan survived, but the memory endured, and long after the last houses were unsealed, the story of the sealed homes remained a haunting reminder that in the struggle against disease, fear itself can become as deadly as the illness it seeks to contain. The Great Plague of London. No less tragic than the disasters on the continent was the epidemic that struck London in 1665, an event remembered in history as the Great Plague of London. One of the most vivid and personal accounts of this catastrophe comes from Samuel Pepys, an English civil servant whose detailed diaries remain among the most powerful eyewitness testimonies of the era. Through his words, we glimpse a city slowly overtaken by fear. The plague entered London quietly, but once inside the densely populated capital, it spread with terrifying speed. Narrow streets, overcrowded houses, and poor sanitation turned the city into fertile ground for infection. Within weeks, Entire neighborhoods were affected. Authorities acted with desperation. Public gatherings were strictly forbidden. Theaters, fairs, markets, and taverns were shut down on the doors of infected houses. Officials painted large red crosses, grim symbols of death, and stationed guards nearby to ensure that no one entered or escaped. Yet these measures proved insufficient. Hundreds of people died every single day. As in the 14th century, carts once again rolled through the streets, collecting the dead. Pepys wrote of a city living in constant dread, where every sound, every cough, every stranger inspired terror. Even family members avoided one another, fearing that affection itself could be fatal. London's vibrant daily life collapsed. Shops closed. Streets emptied. Silence settled over districts that once buzzed with trade and conversation. Only a few desperate figures ventured outside, their faces wrapped in cloths soaked in vinegar or aromatic oils, hoping to ward off the invisible threat. As before, the wealthy fled the city for the countryside. The poor had no such escape. They remained behind, waiting often helplessly for sickness or death to arrive at their door. Another enduring literary testimony of this time is a journal of the plague year, written by Daniel Defoe. Though Defoe himself was not an eyewitness to the 1665 epidemic, he meticulously gathered survivor accounts, official records, and oral histories. Crafting a hauntingly realistic portrait of life during the plague, Defoe described scenes of profound horror, the sick being dragged into the streets to protect their families, abandoned to die alone. In moments of unbearable suffering and isolation, some chose to end their own lives rather than endure the agony of disease and abandonment. As if the plague itself were not enough, London soon faced yet another catastrophe. In 1666, the city was struck by the Great Fire of London. The inferno destroyed vast portions of the old city, especially the overcrowded slums and impoverished districts that had long been centers of filth and infection. Many contemporaries interpreted the fire as a form of divine purification, a cleansing force that burned away the remnants of disease and corruption left behind by the plague. Though the fire was itself a tragedy, killing many and leaving tens of thousands homeless, it ultimately paved the way for a transformed city. London was rebuilt with wider streets, improved construction, and gradually better sanitary conditions. By the end of the epidemic, London had lost approximately 100,000 people, nearly a quarter of its population. The Great Plague of 1665 became the last major outbreak of plague in England. Yet its memory endured. It served as a final, devastating reminder of how vulnerable even the greatest cities remained in the face of epidemic disease, and how thin the line was between civilization and collapse. Disastrous plague doctors. It was during these later bits of plague that the now legendary plague doctors emerged as figures who would become one of the most haunting and recognizable symbols of European epidemics. Doctors tasked with treating plague victims had existed long before, but it was in the 17th century that they gained an official status and a standardized appearance. What had once been a loosely defined role turned into a distinct social function, with clearly prescribed duties, authority, and attire. The plague doctor was no longer merely a local healer. He became an agent of the city, a visible representative of order in a time of chaos. In 1619, a French court physician named Charles de Lorme, serving the royal household, proposed the now famous protective outfit that would define the image of the plague doctor for centuries. The costume was both practical and symbolic, designed to shield the wearer while also inspiring obedience and fear. The attire consisted of a long coat made of leather or waxed fabric, gloves, high boots, and a wide-brimmed hat. But the most striking element was the mask, a rigid face covering with a long, curved beak. This eerie silhouette quickly spread, especially in France and Italy. Though some regions of Europe never fully adopted the beak mask, the beak itself held great importance inside it. Doctors placed aromatic herbs and substances with strong scents: lavender, rosemary, thyme, camphor, cloves, and sponges soaked in vinegar. This practice was rooted in the dominant medical theory of the time, the belief in miasmas, poisonous airs thought to rise from decay, filth, and stagnant water. Disease, people believed, was carried by corrupted air. Strong fragrances were thought to cleanse what the doctor breathed and protect him from infection. In reality, of course, the mask offered little real protection against plague, yet it played a powerful psychological role. It gave doctors a sense of security and authority, and it projected an image of control in a world that felt completely out of control. For the population, however, the sight of a plague doctor was deeply unsettling. His arrival almost always meant that death was near. To ordinary people, the beaked figure symbolized disaster, a silent messenger of suffering. In some cities, rumors spread that plague doctors themselves carried the disease, bringing it from house to house rather than curing it. As a result, they were both feared and, paradoxically, respected. Another important element of the plague doctor's appearance was the staff or cane he carried. This object served several purposes. It allowed doctors to examine patients from a distance, lift clothing, or point to swollen areas without touching them directly. But the staff also functioned as a symbol of authority. With it, doctors issued instructions to assistants, enforced isolation rules, and sometimes even helped maintain order among frightened crowds. In this way, the plague doctor often became more than a physician. He could transform into an enforcer of quarantine, a stern guardian of public order. To many citizens, this blurred line between healer and overseer was deeply unsettling. Despite their ominous presence, plague doctors often held low professional status. During epidemics, experienced physicians were scarce, and many refused to risk their lives. As a result, the role was frequently filled by young, inexperienced doctors, or even by individuals with little or no medical training at all. In some cases, clerks or city officials were appointed to the position. Their primary task was rarely to cure the sick, as real treatment was largely impossible. Instead, they were responsible for recording cases, counting the dead, organizing isolation, and enforcing quarantine measures. They became chroniclers of death rather than agents of healing. By the mid-17th century, quarantines and sanitary cordons had become standard practice in many European cities. Armed guards surrounded infected districts. Streets were blocked with barricades. Any violation of quarantine rules was punished harshly, sometimes with imprisonment, and in extreme cases, even execution. Historical records describe instances in which people were publicly executed for breaking quarantine, meant as grim warnings to others. These acts reflected the desperation of authorities trying to control an invisible enemy and force frightened populations into compliance. Though brutal and deeply flawed, these early measures of protective clothing, isolation protocols, record keeping, and enforced quarantine marked an important turning point. They represented one of the first steps toward organized public health and the early foundations of epidemiology. Out of fear, suffering, and trial and error, Europe slowly began to learn how to confront disease not only with prayer and superstition, but with structure, observation, and collective responsibility. And the silent figure of the plague doctor, standing between life and death, remains a haunting reminder of that painful beginning. The last plague epidemics in Europe of the 18th century marked a turning point in European history, a time when the continent endured its final great Outbreaks of plague, events that would permanently reshape how societies understood and confronted infectious disease. The most devastating and symbolic of these late epidemics in Western Europe was the Great Plague of Marseille in 1720. It would become the last major plague catastrophe to strike the region on such a scale, and its lessons would echo far beyond the city's walls. The outbreak began with the arrival of a merchant ship ominously named Grand Saint-Antoine. The vessel entered the port of Marseille after sailing from the eastern Mediterranean, carrying a valuable cargo of silk, cotton, and other luxury goods purchased in the Levant. Hidden within this cargo, however, was death itself. Despite strict quarantine regulations that had been developed over centuries of painful experience, the city's authorities made a fatal decision. Pressured by economic interests and reassured by incomplete inspections, they allowed the ship to unload its goods. Within days, sailors and dock workers began to follow. What followed was swift and merciless. Marseille was one of the largest and busiest ports in Europe at the time, densely populated, tightly packed, and deeply interconnected with regional and international trade routes. These very strengths became deadly vulnerabilities. The disease spread rapidly from district to district, igniting panic and overwhelming the city. As the scale of the disaster became undeniable, authorities scrambled to regain control. Harsh emergency measures were imposed. City gates were sealed. Travel in and out of Marseille was forbidden. Armed guards patrolled streets and borders. Houses suspected of infection were isolated. Hospitals overflowed. The dead accumulated faster than they could be buried. Mass graves were dug on the outskirts of the city. In some neighborhoods, bodies were burned in the streets to prevent further contagion. Fear, hunger, and despair ruled daily life. But the response came too late. By the time the epidemic subsided, nearly 40,000 people had died, almost half of Marseille's population. The surrounding towns and villages also suffered heavily, as the disease had already escaped beyond the city before containment measures were fully enforced. The plague did not discriminate. It claimed the lives of the poor and the wealthy alike, merchants, officials, laborers, and nobles. Entire families vanished. Commercial life collapsed. Streets fell silent. Yet despite the devastation, one crucial difference set this epidemic apart from earlier medieval catastrophes. Authorities acted with unprecedented determination and coordination. Though brutal, their containment strategies largely succeeded in preventing the plague from spreading across France and Western Europe. For this reason, the Marseille Plague of 1720 is often regarded as the final great plague disaster of Western Europe. To the east, however, the story was not yet entirely over. In parts of Eastern Europe and the Ottoman territories, plague outbreaks continued to appear for some decades longer. But the age of continent-wide devastation was drawing to a close. By the 18th century, Europe had changed. Quarantine systems were more systematic. Sanitary controls were more organized. Trade was increasingly regulated. And slowly, painfully, societies had learned that epidemics were not only acts of divine punishment, but phenomena that could be studied, contained, and eventually understood. The long terror of plague had not vanished overnight, but with the tragedy of Marseille, Europe stood at the threshold of a new era, one in which fear began to give way, however cautiously, to reason. And so ended a chapter of history written in silence. Bells, mass graves, and smoke, a chapter that forever altered the fate of a continent. The plague of Moscow, one of the last and most tragic plague epidemics in Europe, unfolded not in the West, but in the heart of Eastern Europe, in Moscow and the central regions of the Russian Empire during the early 1770s. This outbreak would become the largest and deadliest plague epidemic in Russian history, arriving at a time when Europe believed such disasters belonged to the distant past. The causes of the Moscow plague were complex. Trade routes and merchant caravans played a role, as they always had. But a decisive factor was war. During the Russo-Turkish conflict, Russian troops operated in regions near the Danube, where plague remained endemic. When soldiers and supply convoys began returning north, they unknowingly carried the disease with them. From the southern borders of the empire, the infection slowly advanced inland. When the plague reached Moscow, it spread with terrifying speed. The city was densely populated, sanitation was poor, and medical understanding remained limited. Panic erupted almost immediately. Authorities were unprepared, and the first attempts at isolation were inconsistent, hesitant, and poorly enforced. Within weeks, the epidemic spiraled out of control. Moscow began to empty. Shops closed. Markets fell silent. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned as residents fled the city, often carrying the disease with them. The streets filled with the dead, so many that there were not enough people left to bury them. Bodies lay collected for days. The scale of the catastrophe was immense. More than 50,000 people perished, roughly a quarter of the city's population. Fear and despair overtook reason. Rumors spread rapidly, feeding suspicion and rage. Faced with total collapse, the imperial authorities resorted to force. Troops and police units were deployed to enforce strict quarantines. Roads were blocked. Entire districts were sealed off. A special plague commission was established to oversee containment, isolation, and burial procedures. But for many Muscovites, these measures felt less like protection and more like imprisonment. Distrust of officials and physicians reached a breaking point. In 1771, fear erupted into violence in what became known as the Plague Riot of Moscow. Enraged crowds attacked quarantine posts, hospitals, and monasteries. Many believed that doctors and officials were deliberately spreading the disease or hiding cures from the people. Churches were stormed. Icons were seized. Clergy were attacked. Order collapsed. The rebellion was eventually crushed with brutal force. Troops restored control. Executions followed, and quarantines were enforced more harshly than before. Only then did the epidemic begin to subside. The Moscow plague left deep scars, not only in population loss, but in memory. It revealed that even in the late 18th century, societies remained vulnerable to ancient diseases. It exposed the fragile relationship between authority and the people in times of crisis. And it demonstrated that fear, when combined with uncertainty, could be as destructive as the disease itself. The epidemic of Moscow stands as one of the final echoes of Europe's long struggle with plague. A grim reminder that progress does not erase vulnerability, and the line between order and chaos can vanish with frightening speed. In the end, the plague retreated once more. But it left behind silence, graves, and a lesson written in suffering, one that Europe would never fully forget. Why the plague disappeared. By the end of the 18th century, plague had gradually vanished from Europe. The disease that had haunted the continent for centuries, returning again and again in waves of terror, finally loosened its grip. This disappearance was not the result of a single discovery or miracle cure, but the outcome of several long-term changes that slowly reshaped European society. First and foremost, strict control of trade routes and quarantine measures became the norm rather than the exception. European states, hardened by centuries of epidemics, began to treat public health as a permanent responsibility. Ports were closely monitored. Incoming ships were subjected to systematic sanitary inspections. Cargoes were isolated, crews detained, and entire vessels held offshore for weeks if even the slightest suspicion of disease arose. What had once been emergency improvisation became routine policy. Second, urban living conditions improved significantly. Cities began to change their relationship with cleanliness and space. Streets were cleaned more regularly. Open sewage channels were covered or removed. Waste disposal became more organized. Over time, people also began to pay greater attention to personal hygiene, washing more frequently, airing living spaces, and avoiding some of the worst overcrowding that had once been normal. These changes may appear modest by modern standards, but in historical context they represented a profound transformation. Cities slowly became less hospitable to the parasites and rodents that had played a crucial role in the spread of plague. There is also a well-known scientific hypothesis concerning the disappearance of the black rat, which had been the primary host for plague-carrying fleas. Over time, it was gradually displaced in many European regions by the brown rat, a species less susceptible to these parasites and less likely to live in close proximity to humans. Historians and epidemiologists continue to debate the importance of this factor. While it is not considered a complete explanation on its own, it likely contributed to the broader decline of plague transmission. Most scholars today agree that social and medical factors were decisive. The development of permanent hospitals and lazarettos, the institutionalization of quarantine systems, and the emergence of early public health administration fundamentally altered how societies responded to disease. Plague did not disappear because it was conquered in battle, but because the environment that once allowed it to thrive was slowly dismantled. The long-term legacy of the Black Death and its later outbreaks was a profound shift in how Europeans understood health, illness, and responsibility. Disease was no longer seen solely as divine punishment or fate beyond human control. Increasingly, it became something that could be managed imperfectly, slowly, and at great cost through organization, prevention, and collective action. In this sense, the disappearance of plague from Europe was not an ending, but a transformation. It marked the quiet beginning of modern public health, born from centuries of fear, loss, and hard-earned experience. The plague faded from daily life, but it never truly vanished from memory. The legacy of the plague exposed, with brutal clarity, the complete helplessness of medieval medicine. Physicians, scholars, and rulers were forced to confront a painful truth. Traditional explanations and ancient theories were no longer enough. This realization became a turning point. Slowly, and often through trial and error, people began searching for more rational and practical ways to confront disease. As a result, the first permanent hospitals were established not merely as places of charity, but as institutions meant to isolate, observe, and manage illness. Cities began to introduce systematic street cleaning, waste removal, and basic sanitary regulations. Over time, hygiene ceased to be an occasional precaution and became part of everyday life. These changes laid the foundation for modern medicine and epidemiology, permanently altering how people understood health, illness, and their relationship with the environment around them. Yet the legacy of the plague was not only medical or practical. Its cultural impact was equally profound. The image of epidemic disease as a symbol of the end of the world became deeply embedded in European consciousness. From medieval chronicles filled with visions of divine punishment, to later literary works and tragedies, plague came to represent humanity's deepest fears: fear of death, of chaos, of forces beyond control. This influence echoed through centuries of art, literature, and philosophy. Death and disease appeared again and again as the great equalizers, indifferent to wealth, power, or status. Kings and peasants, saints and sinners, all were shown as equally fragile in the face of mortality. Painters depicted skeletal figures leading humanity in grim dances. Writers explored despair, guilt, and the fleeting nature of life. Thinkers reflected on suffering as an unavoidable part of the human condition. In this way, the plague reshaped not only cities and institutions, but the inner world of Europe itself. It forced societies to reckon with vulnerability, to question old certainties, and to confront the reality that life could change or end without warning. The disease eventually disappeared from Europe, but its shadow remained. In memory, in art, and in the structures of modern society, the plague left behind a lasting reminder that progress is born not only from triumph, but from catastrophe, and that awareness of mortality can, paradoxically, become the foundation for compassion, knowledge, and care. The silence that followed the plague was not empty. It was filled with lessons that shaped the future. The discovery of the plague's true cause. Only at the end of the 19th century did humanity finally unravel the mystery of the disease that had terrorized Europe for centuries. In 1894, during a plague outbreak in Hong Kong, the Swiss microbiologist Alexander Yersin made a discovery that would change medical history forever. He identified the bacterium responsible for the disease, later named Yersinia pestis in his honor. For the first time, plague was no longer an abstract curse, a divine punishment, or a poisonous wind drifting through the streets. It had a tangible cause, a microscopic organism that could be observed, studied, and understood. Yet one crucial piece of the puzzle was still missing. 4 years later, in 1898, the French physician and researcher Paul-Louis Simon provided the final answer. Through careful observation and experimentation, he demonstrated that plague was transmitted to humans by fleas that lived on rats. When infected rats died, their fleas sought new hosts, often humans, spreading the bacterium with devastating efficiency. With this discovery, centuries of confusion suddenly fell into place. The mass deaths, the crowded cities, the role of rodents, the apparent randomness of outbreaks, all of it could finally be explained. The ancient theory of miasmas, the belief in poisoned air, was proven wrong. The plague was not carried by evil vapors or supernatural forces, but by a precise biological chain of transmission. This moment marked the true end of the long struggle with plague, not because the disease disappeared entirely, but because humanity finally understood its nature. From that point on, prevention became possible in ways never imagined before. Controlling rat populations, managing sanitation, isolating cases, and later developing antibiotics transformed plague from an unstoppable apocalypse into a treatable disease. The discovery of Yersinia pestis did more than solve a historical mystery. It symbolized the birth of modern bacteriology and epidemiology, a shift from fear and superstition toward science and prevention. After centuries of darkness, the enemy had finally been named, and in naming it, humanity reclaimed a measure of control over one of the deadliest forces it had ever faced. Today, the Black Death remains one of the greatest tragedies in European history, a catastrophe that reshaped the world beyond recognition. It shattered cities, overturned beliefs, and forced humanity to confront its own vulnerability in the face of forces it could not yet understand. Although the disease itself was eventually brought under control, its legacy never truly disappeared. It continues to live on in culture, in science, and in collective memory, reminding us how fragile civilization can be, and how quickly certainty can dissolve into fear. The plague taught humanity painful lessons about ignorance and arrogance, but also about resilience, adaptation, and the slow birth of knowledge. From the ashes of catastrophe emerged new ways of thinking about medicine, public health, responsibility, and the value of human life. In this sense, the Black Death was not only an ending, but also a beginning, a dark passage that led, centuries later, toward understanding and prevention. As we look back on this history today, it serves as a quiet warning and a lasting reminder. The future is never guaranteed, And preparedness, compassion, and reason matter more than we often realize. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If you found this journey meaningful, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss future lectures. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Your reflections are always welcome. Until our next story, rest well and good night.